The battle raged like a storm, but even storms have quiet moments. Between volleys of gunfire, when the posse regrouped in the distance and the ranch fell into tense silence, something else stirred, something that had nothing to do with bullets or blood. Jenny leaned against the water trough, her chest heaving, a grin splitting her dirt-streaked face. She had a revolver in each hand, smoke still curling from the barrels. "Hell," she panted, "I ain't never felt so alive." The rancher glanced at her, then at the others who had taken cover behind fences and barrels. Their faces were drawn, their hair wild, their clothes stained with sweat and powder. Yet in their eyes burned the same fierce fire that matched his own. May dropped from the roof of the barn, landing light as a cat, her rifle slung across her back. She strode up to him, calm as ever, though her knuckles were white. "They'll hit harder next wave. We'll need every shot to count." He nodded, but for a heartbeat, their eyes held. May's gaze was steady, unblinking, carrying not just warning but something deeper, a silent vow that she would stand by him, no matter how many men came riding. Cora, dust smeared across her sharp cheekbones, leaned against a post nearby. She had always been the leader, the one who kept the others moving, but even she couldn't hide the way her gaze lingered on the rancher when she thought no one watched. He saw it now, saw the steel in her softening, saw the loneliness that mirrored his own. "Don't go dying on us," she muttered, her voice rough. "We ain't carried you this far to watch you fall." The words twisted something inside him. For years he had lived without anyone to care whether he breathed or bled. Now here were 7 women, hardened by the world, yet looking at him as though he was worth standing beside Dot as the next volley of bullets cracked against the barn. Jenny darted to his side, laughing wildly. "You shoot straighter than half the men I've known. If we live through this, rancher, you just might be the death of me." She winked before tearing off again, firing into the dust. For the first time in decades, the rancher felt something strange claw its way into his chest warmth. It wasn't the kind of warmth the fire gave, nor the kind the sun spread across the plains. It was something alive, burning brighter than the muzzle flashes all around him. The women weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting for him, for each other. And that truth cut deeper than any bullet ever could. Dot at one point. When the gunfire lulled again, May pressed a flask into his hand. "Drink, you'll need it." Their fingers brushed, and he felt it, an unspoken bond that neither dust nor blood could erase. Later, Cora barked at Jenny for wasting bullets, but when the rancher caught her eye, she smiled, brief, reluctant, but real. It was the first smile he'd ever seen from her. The fight pressed on, wave after wave, but in the chaos bloomed something impossible: tenderness. Jenny's laughter ringing like music in the smoke. May's steady presence at his side, a calm anchor in the storm. Cora's fierce loyalty, even as she cursed the sky. For a man who had lived in silence, who had once believed the land would bury him alone, this was a revelation. The ranch wasn't just a patch of earth anymore. It was alive with gunfire, yes, but also with heart, with love. And though bullets screamed and blood painted the dust, the rancher knew something with startling clarity. If he fell today, he wouldn't fall alone. And if he lived, he would never again face an empty house. The sun was high by the time the last wave of riders charged. Dust boiled on the horizon like a storm cloud, the sheriff's men shouting as they spurred their horses hard. The ground trembled beneath the thundering hooves, rattling the ranch to its bones. Dot inside the yard, the rancher stood tall with his rifle slung across his shoulder. His face was carved from stone, but his heart hammered like a war drum. Around him, the 7 women took their places, battered, bruised, but unbroken. They had fought through the night, held the line again and again, and now it all came down to this. Cora spat into the dirt, eyes blazing. "This is it, girls. Either we send them running or they bury us here." Jenny whooped, twirling her revolver like it was a toy. "Ain't no graveyard big enough for us." May said nothing. She simply chambered another round, her calm steadying the air like the eye of a hurricane. The rancher gave a short nod. "Then we hold." The posse poured down the ridge like a flood. Gunfire cracked, bullets slicing through the air. The barricades shook under the assault, wood splintering, smoke filling every breath. Horses screamed as they hit wire, men fell shouting, and the ground became slick with blood and dust. Jenny darted through the chaos, her laugh wild as she fired from cover to cover. May picked men off with surgical precision, each shot true. Lila, arm still bandaged, clutched a shotgun, blasting at any rider who dared too close. Even quiet Anna, usually timid, threw bottles of lamp oil that burst into flame. Sending riders scattering in panic, the rancher fought like a man reborn. Every shot he fired was vengeance for years of silence, every strike of his rifle but a promise that this land would not fall. He moved with purpose, protecting the women at his side, driving the attackers back inch by inch. Then the sheriff rode in. His silver badge gleamed in the sun, his revolver raised high. His face was twisted with fury, his voice bellowing above the din. "This ends now. That ranch is mine, and I'll burn every last one of you to take it." The rancher stepped forward, leaving the cover of the barricades. Dust swirled around his boots, bullets zipping past. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the man who had ruled the town with fear, and the man who had chosen solitude until 7 outlaws gave him a reason to fight again. "You'll take nothing," the rancher said, his voice low but carrying. The sheriff sneered and spurred his horse forward. The revolver came up, gleaming in the sun. But before he could fire, May's rifle cracked. The shot hit true, tearing the revolver from his hand. The sheriff roared, reeling in the saddle. That was all the opening the rancher needed. He raised his rifle, fired once, and the sheriff tumbled from his horse, crashing into the dirt with a final, echoing thud. For a moment, silence. The posse faltered, staring at their fallen leader. Then, like a wave breaking, they wheeled their horses and fled, scattering into the hills, their courage broken. The ranch yard stank of smoke and gunpowder, bodies strewn across the dust. The barricades were shattered, fences torn, but the ranch still stood. And so did they. Jenny fell back against the trough, laughing through tears. Cora wiped blood from her cheek and gave the rancher a long, steady look. May slung her rifle across her back, nodding once as though the matter was settled. The rancher let out a slow breath, lowering his rifle. He looked around at the women 7 outlaws who had ridden into his life like a storm, who had turned his silence into fire. "This land's ours now," Cora said, her voice rough but certain. The rancher met her gaze, then looked to the others. For the first time in years, he smiled. Not because the fight was over, but because the ranch was no longer just his. It was theirs. Together they had made a final stand, and together they had won. The warning came on a windless morning, when the sky was too still and the birds too quiet. May, the riflewoman, was perched on the roof of the barn, her eyes sharp against the distance. She slid down the ladder fast, boots kicking dust. "Riders," she said, her voice clipped. "Not the sheriff. Too many. 8, maybe 10, armed." The yard froze. Jenny, who had been teasing a calf near the corral, dropped her rope and ran for her horse. Cora cursed under her breath and looked to the rancher. For all their bravado, every one of the women turned their eyes to him, as though the solitary man they'd unsettled for weeks now held the key to their survival. The rancher didn't waste words. "How far?" "Couple miles out." "Moving steady," May replied. The rancher's jaw tightened. His life had been built on silence and solitude, but that silence had been shattered the moment he let these women in. Now their trouble was riding straight toward his gates. "Then we don't wait for them to knock," he said, his tone final. He led them across the yard, showing them what the land itself had taught him. A gully behind the barn where riflemen could lie hidden. An old hunting blind near the ridge that overlooked the only trail wide enough for a full posse to ride. Narrow gaps between fence rails where a quick hand with a revolver could hold off 3 men at once. The women listened, sharp and ready, their outlaw instincts meshing with his knowledge of the land. Jenny grinned with wild excitement, as if she'd been waiting her whole life for this. May checked her rifle twice, her movements calm and exact. Lila, the gambler, muttered about odds under her breath, though her hands were steady as she loaded shells. Even Cora, the leader who had never bowed to anyone, gave him a short nod, letting him call the plays dot by the time the posse crested the far ridge. The ranch had been remade into a fortress. The first shots cracked the stillness. A bullet pinged off the barn door, splintering wood. Horses screamed. Dust rose. The outlaws answered with fire of their own, Jenny whooping as she fired wild from the corral, May dropping a rider clean out of the saddle from her perch, Cora's revolver steady as stone. The rancher moved with grim precision. He hadn't raised his rifle against men in years, but the muscle remembered. His first shot dropped a man who tried to circle the fence. His second tore through the hat of another, sending him scrambling for cover. He felt the old fire blaze through him, the part of himself he thought he'd buried with his past. Gunpowder burned the air. Shouts, curses, and the roar of hooves filled the ranch yard. The land that had known only silence and cattle now rang with chaos. One of the outlaws, Lila, took a hit, the bullet grazing her arm. She hissed in pain but didn't drop her weapon. Jenny dragged her behind the trough, yelling, "You'll live, don't be soft." The rancher glanced at them once, then turned back to the fight. His jaw hard. The battle stretched long, every second hammering like a nail. Dust turned the world hazy, the sun glaring through smoke. But the ranch held. Every gully, every fence post, every hidden angle the rancher had shown them became a weapon in their hands. At last, the surviving riders broke, wheeling their horses and fleeing into the horizon. Their shouts faded into distance, leaving behind only the stench of blood and the stillness of death. The women emerged from their hiding spots, panting, faces streaked with sweat and dust. Jenny whooped again, throwing her hat in the air. May simply nodded once, satisfaction flickering in her eyes. But the rancher didn't celebrate. He stood in the yard, rifle still in hand, staring at the trail of blood and hoof prints stretching away into the distance. Blood had been spilled on his land again. He had opened his gates, and the storm had brought ruin to his doorstep. Yet as he turned and saw the women gathering, tired, bruised, but alive, he realized something else. For the first time in years, he hadn't stood alone. The first attack had only been the beginning. The rancher knew it as surely as he knew the shape of his land. Men like the sheriff didn't send 10 riders unless they had another 20 waiting in the wings. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in bruised colors, the ranch became a war camp. Cora paced with her revolver slapping against her thigh, her sharp voice cutting through the dusk. "They'll be back. With more. They want us alive or dead. Doesn't matter which." Jenny leaned against a fence post, still flushed with excitement from the fight. "Let 'em come. We'll put 'em all in the dirt. Not if we run out of bullets," May countered, cool and precise as she cleaned her rifle. "We held today because we were ready. Next time, they'll know the ground better. They'll push harder." The rancher stood among them, quiet, but his mind spun like a whetstone against steel. He had lived through wars before, feuds, land skirmishes, gunfights that left bodies rotting in the dust. This fight was bigger, different. It wasn't just his land at stake anymore. It was these 7 women who had bound themselves to him with fire, laughter, and blood. "We dig in," he said finally. His voice carried no argument. "We know this land better than any man riding against us. If they come, they bleed for every inch." The work began. By lamplight, they built barricades from hay bales and wagon wheels. They dug shallow trenches behind the corral and strung wire across the narrow path that cut between the barn and the ridge. Buckets of water were drawn, barrels of grain rolled into cover, lanterns placed where shadows could be used as traps. Jenny, eager and restless, rode into the dark hills with May, scouting for signs of movement. They returned hours later, dust clinging to their coats, bringing grim news. "A whole damned posse," Jenny said, eyes shining in the lantern glow. "At least 20. They'll be here by dawn." The rancher's chest tightened, but he gave a slow nod. He had expected nothing less. That night was heavy with silence. Some of the women played cards around the table, the flicker of lamplight dancing across their tired faces. Lila joked softly, though her wounded arm was bandaged and stiff. Cora sat apart, sharpening her knife, her jaw set hard as stone. The rancher stood watch outside, staring across the land he had worked alone for years. The stars burned cold above him. He thought of the quiet he had once loved, the life of silence and cattle. Now his land pulsed with life and danger. He wasn't sure if he regretted it or if, in some strange way, he was grateful. The first shots came with the sunrise. A crack of a rifle split the dawn, sending the women scattering to their posts. Dust plumes rose on the horizon riders, dozens of them, pushing fast. The sheriff himself led the charge, his wide-brimmed hat and silver badge catching the new sun like fire. "Hold steady!" The rancher barked. His voice was iron. Gunfire roared. May's rifle sang from the roof of the barn, dropping one rider after another before they could get close. Jenny whooped as she darted between barricades, her revolver spitting fire. Cora stood tall at the gate, her pistol shots methodical, each one finding a target. The posse pushed harder, circling, trying to break through the wire and fences. Horses screamed. Dust boiled around the ranch yard. The sound was deafening, bullets tearing wood, glass shattering, men yelling as they fell. At one point, 3 riders managed to push through the corral fence. The rancher met them head-on. His shotgun roared once-twice, blasting them back in a spray of dust and blood. He moved like a man possessed, not just defending land, but defending something he hadn't realized mattered more: his people. The battle stretched on, brutal and unrelenting. The ranch burned with smoke and fire, the air thick with the stench of gunpowder. Each of the 7 women fought with ferocity, as if the ranch had become theirs too. When the sheriff finally rode forward, revolver raised high, the rancher saw him clearly. This wasn't about justice. It wasn't about law. It was power, the kind of power that had ruled over this land for too long. The rancher raised his rifle. The women rallied around him. The war for the ranch wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt the tide shift. They weren't outlaws anymore. They were defenders. A family. And they would spill blood before they let the ranch fall. The next morning broke cold and sharp, the prairie sky pale blue with streaks of silver clouds drifting lazily overhead. The rancher rose before dawn, as he always did, and found the 7 women already awake. Bedrolls were folded, saddles strapped tight, and rifles within reach. Even fugitives, it seemed, lived by discipline. He didn't say good morning. He never did. Instead, he pointed to a sagging fence line that needed mending, a half-empty trough that needed filling, and a stack of logs split unevenly the night before. "If you're staying, you're working," he said flatly. To his quiet surprise, they didn't argue. The outlaws divided the tasks like they had done this kind of labor before, or maybe survival had taught them to adapt anywhere. By the time the sun burned high, The ranch was alive with motion, more alive than it had been in years. The scarred leader, Cora, worked the fence beside him, her hands steady on the posts. She didn't waste words, but her silence wasn't empty, it was deliberate, like she carried her thoughts in neat rows the way a rancher carried his tools. The rancher recognized something of himself in her restraint. The quiet riflewoman called May, he learned it kept watch more than she worked. Her eyes swept the horizon, sharp and unreadable. When she did speak, it was brief, always about distance, cover, or how many riders could cross the ridge before sundown. She was a soldier in spirit, and she never let her rifle drift far from her lap. The youngest Jenny was all restless energy. She tried every chore with a grin, laughing when she spilled half a bucket of water or dropped an armload of wood. "Don't worry, rancher," she teased more than once. "I'll get the hang of it before your cows starve." Her spirit reminded him of a colt too wild for a corral dangerous, but hard not to watch. Then there was Layla, the one with copper-colored hair. She had quick hands and a quicker tongue, chattering as she worked. "Back in Missouri, I swore I'd never touch another shovel," she said while scooping feed for the cattle. "Funny how promises break when you're running for your hide." Her humor was sharp but not cruel, and though the rancher kept his face still, he felt something stir in him when she laughed out another woman, dark-eyed and quiet, tended to the horses. She sang softly under her breath an old tune, low and steady. Her voice carried across the corral, filling the air with a strange comfort. The animals leaned into her touch, calmed by her presence. For a moment, the rancher found himself listening, as if the sound itself filled a hollow place he hadn't realized was emptied out as the hours passed. The rancher noticed how each woman revealed her edges. He saw Jenny's reckless streak when she climbed the fence barefoot, daring it to collapse under her. He saw May's cold calculation when she muttered, "This place could be fortified if it came to it." He saw Lila's sly glance toward the horizon, as if she was always plotting her next gamble. And Cora's steady, unyielding seemed to watch him as much as he watched her, as if she too was measuring the worth of the man whose land they stood upon. By evening, the chores were done. The cattle were fed, the fences patched, and the water troughs brimming. The women gathered near the porch, eating beans and cornbread from the rancher's iron pot. Their voices rose and fell, laughter mixing with low arguments. Jenny teased Lila about her crook stitching on a saddle strap. May muttered that talking so loud would bring riders down on them before midnight. Cora sat apart, her eyes on the horizon, always listening. The rancher sat in his rocking chair, plate balanced on his knee, saying nothing. Yet his silence was different now. The house no longer felt hollow. The air was alive with voices, rough but real, and the sound reached places in him he had long since boarded shut. But with the warmth came unease. These women weren't guests, at least not in the safe, ordinary sense. They were outlaws, branded dangerous by the law, carrying gold that wasn't theirs and blood on their hands. Their presence was fire on dry grass, warming for now, but one spark away from ruin. Still, as the stars wheeled overhead and their laughter rolled across the ranch yard, the rancher knew something had shifted. The silence he had lived with for years was broken, and he wasn't sure he wanted it back. Days with the outlaws stretched into a week, though no one spoke of it aloud. Each morning they rose early, shouldering work like they belonged there. Yet each night their eyes flicked toward the horizon as if expecting the law to appear at any moment. The rancher said little, but he felt their presence press into every corner of his quiet life. His land, once silent, now echoed with voices, bootsteps, and the ring of hammers against wood. He told himself it was temporary, a storm passing through. But deep inside, he knew storms always left their mark. It was on a sun-bleached afternoon that the past came calling. The sheriff rode out from town, his horse kicking up a thin trail of dust as it crossed the prairie. The rancher spotted him long before he reached the gate. His gut tightened. He didn't like visitors, least of all men who wore stars on their chest. The sheriff was a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and eyes that missed little. He reined in at the gate and tipped his hat. "Afternoon, rancher. Heard tell there's trouble blowing through these parts." The rancher rested one hand on the fence rail, the other near his hip. "Always trouble somewhere," he said flatly. The sheriff studied him a moment, chewing the inside of his cheek. "7 women," he said at last. "Riders. Robbed a train. Word is they're cutting through this county." His gaze swept over the ranch, lingering on the house, the barn, the open yard. "You seen anything?" The rancher's jaw tightened. He thought of Cora's scarred face, May's cold watchfulness, Jenny's wild grin. He thought of the laughter around his porch last night and the way the empty house no longer echoed like a tomb. For a long moment, silence pressed between him and the lawman. "No," the rancher said finally. His voice was steady, but inside something twisted tight. The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he'd expected that answer. He leaned forward in the saddle. "They're dangerous, you know. Left men dead on that train. They won't stop unless someone puts them in the ground. You do well to keep your rifle loaded." The rancher gave a short nod, the kind that ended conversations. After a moment, the sheriff tipped his hat again and turned his horse. Dust trailed after him as he rode back toward town. The rancher stood there until the figure disappeared into the horizon. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. He had lied for them, and the weight of that choice settled heavy in his chest. That night, as the women laughed over cards at the kitchen table, the rancher sat on the porch, staring out into the dark. Memories stirred memories he had buried deep. His wife's face, smiling in lamplight. His daughter's small hands tugging at his sleeve. And the night they were taken from him by men who rode in just as hard, just as ruthless. As these women had, he had sworn then never to trust another soul. Never to open his home or his heart again. Solitude had been his armor, his punishment, and his peace. But now, with 7 outlaws under his roof, that oath lay cracked and broken. He heard the door creak behind him. It was Cora. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "Sheriff come sniffing, didn't he?" The rancher didn't answer. She studied him a moment, then said quietly, "We ain't your past, rancher. Whatever ghost you've got, they ain't us." Her words struck deeper than he cared to admit, because the truth was, those ghosts had never left. They haunted his silence, his loneliness, every empty room in that house. And now, with the women's laughter spilling through the doorway, the ghost stirred restless, reminding him of everything he had lost and everything he stood to lose again. The outlaws waited at the edge of his land, their horses restless, snorting, stamping holes into the hard-packed dirt. Dust clung to their coats and hair, painting them in the colors of the desert. The rancher stood a few yards away, his rifle steady in his hands, the barrel angled just enough to remind them he hadn't decided whether they were welcome or targets. Silence stretched between them, taut as a rope pulled too tight. Only the creak of leather saddles and the wheeze of the wind through the dry grass filled the gap. The leader, the tall woman with the scar, met his gaze without flinching. She had the kind of eyes that didn't blink first. "We ain't here to cause you harm," she said evenly, though her hand rested on her revolver's grip. "We just need water for the horses, a place to rest. One night. That's all." The rancher's gray eyes flicked from her to the others. The younger one with the wild grin was already looking past him, toward the house, as if daring to imagine herself inside. The quiet riflewoman never moved, her hat shadowing her expression, though her finger tapped a rhythm against her gunstock. Another, a small, sharp-featured woman shifted in her saddle, muttering something under her breath in a language he didn't catch. He let the silence hang, measuring them the way he measured a storm rolling in, by weight, by speed, by whether it might tear his land apart. "You've got a lot of nerve riding onto my land," he said at last, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. "Bandits, by the look of you." A ripple of laughter came from the group. The young reckless one leaned forward on her saddle horn. "Bandits? Well, that ain't a lie," she drawled. "But don't worry, rancher, we ain't interested in your cows or your beans. Not unless you make us be." The scarred leader shot her a sharp look, and the grin faded. She turned back to the rancher. "Truth is, we're hunted, and hunters don't care much whose land they trample to find us. You let us rest, we'll be gone before dawn. You'll have our word." The rancher's jaw worked as he considered. Their word? Outlaw's promises weighed lighter than smoke. Yet something in her voice wasn't begging, it was bargaining. These women weren't broken fugitives crawling for mercy. They were steel, but steel under heat. His gaze slid to the horses. Foam flecked their hides, their sides heaving. They'd been running hard, maybe from the law, maybe from worse. To turn them away now would drive them straight into desperation, and desperate people were dangerous. He shifted his rifle, though not enough to lower it fully. "Water's down by the trough," he said slowly. "But you step 1 foot toward my cattle or my house without my say-so, and I'll put you down quicker than a rattler in my bedroll." The leader gave a curt nod. "Fair enough." She swung down from her horse with easy grace, her boots stirring up dust. One by one, the others dismounted, the clink of spurs and weapons filling the still air. The rancher felt his pulse thud harder. 7 armed women on his land, each with eyes like wolves caught between hunger and survival. He hadn't had company in years, and certainly never company like this. One of them, a lean woman with copper-colored hair and quick hands, sauntered closer to the gate. She leaned against the fence post, her smile sharp. "Don't fret, rancher," she teased. "We ain't here to rob you blind." "Not unless you're hiding a safe full of gold." The rancher said nothing. He simply kept his rifle trained, his silence as solid as the fence between them. For a moment, no one moved. The dust hung in the air, glowing red in the sinking light, like the whole world held its breath. The standoff was more than guns and threats. It was the meeting of 2 worlds, his, built on solitude and silence, and theirs, bound together by danger and defiance. And as the evening shadows stretched long across the rancher realized that whatever choice he made, mercy or gunfire, it would break the quiet life he had clung to for so long. Night settled over the plains like a heavy blanket. The last streaks of red had bled from the horizon, leaving only the pale light of a rising moon. The rancher leaned against a fence post, rifle still in hand, while the 7 women busied themselves watering their horses at the trough. The sound of snorting animals and splashing water filled the quiet, but beneath it all lay the weight of an unspoken question. How long were they staying? The leader finally turned toward him, her face half shadowed by the brim of her hat. "Name's Cora," she said, breaking the silence. "And you've already guessed right, we're wanted." The rancher didn't answer. He just shifted his weight, his eyes fixed on her with the same steady patience he gave to watching storms roll across the prairie. Cora went on, her voice level. "A train job went sideways. Blood was spilled, law was called. We didn't get what we came for, but we got enough to make us hunted. Every sheriff, every bounty man from here to the border will be sniffing our trail." At that, one of the women, small, wiry, with restless fingers, snorted. "We got more than enough," she muttered. She tapped her boot against a saddlebag that clinked faintly, a sound unmistakable to anyone who had ever handled coins. The rancher's eyes narrowed. Gold. He'd suspected as much. But suspicion was different than hearing it laid plain. Cora shot the smaller woman a sharp look, then turned back to him. "We need a place to cool off." One night. That's all we ask. In return?" She hesitated, then reached into her coat and pulled out a small pouch. She tossed it onto the fence post near him. It landed with a metallic chink. Payment. Fair trade for food, water, and roof. The rancher let the pouch sit. He didn't touch it, didn't even glance down. "Money don't mean much if it draws bullets to my door," he said gruffly. His rifle remained steady in his hands. "Sheriff's already sniffing around. You bring your trouble here, you'll bury me with it." From the shadows, the young reckless one laughed, her grin flashing like a knife. "Bury you? Old man, we'd protect you. You'd be safer with us than without us." The others chuckled, but the rancher didn't flinch. He looked at each of them in turn, measuring, weighing, just as he did with cattle at auction. He saw fire in some, ice in others. He saw hunger, weariness, and the sharp gleam of people who had no place left to run. Cora must have read something in his silence, because she softened her stance just a fraction. "We ain't here to linger," she said. "We won't touch your herd. We won't touch your house without say-so. We'll take what work you offer if that makes it easier for you to swallow. But tonight, rancher, we need ground to rest our heads." That pricked something in him. It had been years since anyone had offered to share labor on his land. Years since another pair of hands had lifted a post or carried water at his side. The thought was as foreign as it was dangerous. He shifted, finally lowering the barrel of his rifle. "Not by much, but enough. You want to stay?" he said at last, his voice carrying the weight of a final judgment. "Then you'll work. Sunrise comes early and I'll have no freeloaders on my land. You water the cattle, you mend the fences, you keep the law off my porch. Do that, and you can have one night under my sky." Cora gave a single nod, the faintest trace of relief crossing her scarred face. "Deal," the others muttered, some scoffing, some grinning. But none argued. They'd been given a sliver of shelter, and that was more than they'd had an hour ago. The rancher picked up the pouch of coins and tossed it back to her. "Keep it. Gold don't patch fences. Work does." Cora caught it, her mouth twitching into something that might have been respect. The outlaws began spreading their bedrolls in the yard, voices low, weapons never far from reach, and the rancher, standing alone in the moonlight, felt the first crack in the wall of silence he had built around himself. He'd let the storm in, for better or for ruin. The ranch stretched wide across the dry plains, where the wind carried dust more faithfully than it carried voices. For years, the land had heard little more than the lowing of cattle, the squeal of rusty hinges, and the sharp crack of an axe against wood. Its keeper, a solitary man known only as the rancher, lived a life as barren of company. As the land was a rain dot, he had not always been alone. Once, long ago, there had been warmth in the old ranch house. A woman's laughter, a child's cry, the glow of lamplight that made even the peeling wallpaper seem golden. But fate or cruelty had stripped him of that. Some said outlaws took them, others whispered sickness did the work. The truth was his alone to bear, and he never spoke it. What was certain was this: the man who had once been full of fire now lived as a ghost in the shape of a rancher. His neighbors in the nearest town, 30 miles away, seldom saw him. When they did, he came quietly, traded his hides or beef for supplies, and left before anyone could press him into conversation. He carried himself with the stiffness of a man who had built walls higher than any corral fence. His eyes, gray and weathered, gave nothing away, though the sheriff, watching him once from across a saloon, muttered, "That man's seen too much." Days blurred into one another. Dawn broke, and he saddled up. His boots carried him over land worn down by hooves and sun. He checked water troughs, counted cattle, fixed the sagging posts of his fence. At noon, he ate bread gone stale or beans he had boiled the night before. By evening, he returned to a house so quiet it seemed abandoned. Only the creak of the rocking chair on the porch reminded him he was still alive. It wasn't that he feared people. He simply had no more to give them. Loneliness had settled into his bones until it became as natural as breathing. The silence of the prairie matched the silence within him. The rancher had made peace with it, or so he thought. Still, even in silence, the world did not forget him. Stories grew around his solitude like weeds along a fence line. In town, some said he was sitting on a fortune from a gold claim gone missing. Others believed he was hiding from a crime no one had yet uncovered. The children whispered he had eyes sharp enough to shoot a rattlesnake dead at 100 yards. And though none of these stories were true, the rancher did nothing to disprove them. Let people think what they wanted. The less they knew, the less they could hurt him. But sometimes, when the sun dipped low and the prairie sky burned red, he would walk to the edge of his land and stare at the horizon. Something restless stirred inside him then, a memory of laughter he could no longer recall clearly, a longing for voices that would never return. He would press his hands against the fence rail, grounding himself in the work, and mutter, "This is enough." Then he would turn back to the house, the cattle, the endless silence. He had lived this way for years. Long enough that the days felt as though they would stretch on forever. Long enough that he believed nothing could surprise him anymore. But life has a way of breaking even the strongest walls. And on a dusty evening, with the sky heavy and red, the sound of distant hoofbeats carried across the plains. 7 riders. 7 shadows against the horizon. And with them came the storm that would shatter his silence for good. The evening was heavy with heat, the kind that clung to the skin and made the air shimmer above the dry earth. The rancher had just finished mending a stretch of fence that had sagged under the weight of time and weather. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his calloused hand, squinting at the horizon. The sun was low, bleeding red across the plains, a warning that the night would be long and restless. Then he heard it at first. It was little more than a murmur beneath the sighing wind, a faint vibration that rattled through the soles of his boots. He straightened, ears straining. The sound grew, a deep rhythmic pounding that rolled across the flat land. Hooves, not one, not 2, but many. The kind of thunder that only a group of fast-moving riders could make. The rancher's heart tightened. Out here, visitors did not arrive in numbers unless trouble rode with them. He reached instinctively for the rifle slung across his shoulder, his fingers resting on the polished woodstock as he turned toward the rising cloud of dust. The sight that emerged from that storm of dirt and sun was like something from a fever dream. 7 riders, their silhouettes sharp against the burning sky. They came fast, reckless, the wind tearing at their hair and coats. Horses foamed and snorted, kicking up plumes of dust that swirled like smoke. At first glance, the rancher assumed they were a gang of men, bandits chasing some cruel design across his land. But as they drew closer, his eyes narrowed in disbelief. They weren't men. They were women, and not the delicate sort townfolk sometimes whispered about in church pews or painted on the walls of saloons. These women were hard-edged, sunburned, and armed to the teeth. Rifles slung across saddles, revolvers at their hips, knives flashing from boot tops. Their faces bore the marks of long days on the trail. Dust, hunger, and the cold determination of survivors. The leader rode at the front, a tall woman with a scar tracing the line of her jaw, her hair bound back in a leather cord. She sat her horse like she was born in the saddle, her gaze steady and unflinching. To her right was a younger one, wild-eyed and restless, a smile tugging at her lips as though the ride itself was enough to stir her blood. Behind them came a quiet one, her eyes shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, a rifle balanced across her lap like an extension of her own arm. The others rode in formation, each carrying herself with a confidence that was both dangerous and magnetic. Beauty clung to them, yes, but it was the sharp, untamed beauty of a storm, the kind that promised both awe and destruction. The rancher stood unmoving as they closed the distance, though his pulse drummed hard against his ribs. He had seen outlaws before, but never like this. Women who looked as though they had carved their own names into the land with grit and gunpowder. The riders slowed. As they reached the edge of his fence line, their horses stamping and blowing dust into the air. For a moment, time seemed to hang between them, the solitary rancher, rifle in hand, and 7 women whose eyes glittered with equal parts defiance and desperation. The leader raised her hand, signaling the others to hold. Then she leaned forward in her saddle, her voice carrying clear through the thick evening air. "Evening, rancher," she called, her tone edged with steel. "We're in need of food, water, and a roof over our heads." "And we in a skin for charity." The rancher didn't answer. He studied them, weighing silence against risk, the rifle against his own gnawing curiosity. In all his years alone, he had thought nothing could surprise him. Yet here stood 7 strangers who already threatened to tear down the walls he had built around his life. Behind the leader, one of the younger women grinned, baring white teeth in the fading light. "What's it gonna be, old man?" she teased. "You letting us in, or do we make ourselves at home?" The rancher's grip tightened on his rifle. The land was his, the silence was his, and for years he had guarded both fiercely. But as the dust settled around those 7 outlaws, he knew that whatever decision he made in the next moment would change everything. And for the first time in years, he hesitated.